Martijn and I showed you that we could design a study that fully replicated the Graham paper, and that we could execute a study that replicated the Graham paper, and that we could obtain the same results. And that's really impressive for us. But this class is not for us, this class is for you. So now we're going to flip the script a little bit. Now you guys are going to design a study, and you guys are going to be able to then understand how you could execute a study if you wanted to. But you are going to design a full replication right now. So you, how many of you read the second piece of homework, which is the paper by Garba et al.?
But it wasn't good.
All right, so most of you read the paper. So I will ask that all of you, if you got a hard copy, pull it out. If you've got it electronically, pull it up, because we're going to be making use of this throughout this exercise. So this paper was looking at, this is the high dimensional versus conventional propensity scores and the comparative effectiveness study of coxibs and reduced GI, upper gastrointestinal complications by Garba et al. Any immediate reactions that people had, those of you that did read it? Any thoughts about the study? Good study, bad study? I think I'll get tased if I respond on the record to that comment, so I'm going to ignore that. Yes, there are esteemed colleagues who collaborate on this paper, so it's pretty good. Any thoughts about it?
Well, compared to the other study that was more based on method than.
Good point. Yeah, so this paper is more methodologically focused than clinically focused, and specifically what they were really drilling into is different ways you can actually do propensity scoring in this particular context. That's a really good point and an important consideration. Yeah. Any other thoughts, reflections about it? In terms of your ability to reproduce this study, do you think you've got what you need in that paper? You think this paper is more explicit? Okay. Okay. So either they're talking in a more familiar language, or at least it feels like maybe there's some of the decisions are more explicit. So could you don't have to be part of OHDSI. This is a volunteer army. So if you don't do things the OHDSI way, do you feel like you just take this paper and go home and code it up and get the same result? They use SAS. Okay, well that's a choice. It's okay to do SAS if you're a SAS programmer. Okay, any other thoughts?
So it seemed like we provided the variables, 79 I believe it was, for the regular propensity scores, but nothing much about the high density. So I don't really know what they were looking at.
So the comment is, so they've got a conventional propensity score where experts pick some variables, and it seems like they did a pretty good job of describing the 70 some odd individual variables. And then what's also going on in this paper is they're applying an algorithm developed by Schuemie et al., which is called high dimensional propensity score, whereby that algorithm uses an ad hoc heuristic to calculate univariate statistics and then make a selection of either 100, 200, 500 variables, and then those variables are just entered into the model. And I think the comment is, well, we don't really know what those things were that this algorithm selected, so you don't really see that. Fair point. Any other thoughts? All right, so let's ask this question a different way. Let's think about this study from the perspective of if we were to apply the OHDSI framework to this. I'm going to ask you 5 questions. What's the T? What's the C? What's the O? What's the time at risk? And what's the model specification? So shout it out. What's the T? I heard, okay. Raise your hand, and I'm going to select one person to give me an appropriate definition of T. Dave. COX-2 inhibitors. That sounds an awful lot like a name of a drug class. People initiating COX-2 inhibitors. Okay. Anybody want to keep riffing off of Dave's definition? Any other aspects to that definition? So we're starting with people who have initiated a COX-2 inhibitor with at least 12 months enrollment prior to exposure. With no NSAID use prior. I'm sorry, could you speak up? Who are over 16 at the time that they took their drug. Without cancer. Okay, so taking people's pieces, we've got new users of COX-2s who have been in the database for a year and who were 18 at the time that they or over 16 at the time that they started, and who don't have cancer in the 12 months prior. Everybody agree that sounds like a good T? It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue for a good title of a paper, but it does sound like a complete definition of a cohort. Okay. What's the C? Someone so raise their hand and start the riff off. Sergio. Sorry.
Same as the T,
Yep.
but using NSAIDs instead of.
So take that same definition of T, but swap out COX-2 and NSAIDs. So new users of an NSAID who have 12 months prior enrollment and were 16 at the time that they started their NSAID and didn't have prior NSAID and didn't have cancer in the last 12 months. Does that sound about right? Okay. What's the O?
People who have bleed or perforation or obstruction in their GI.
People who had a bleed, obstruction, or perforation in their GI tract. Okay? So when does someone enter that cohort? And when do they exit that cohort?
They enter when they have an ICD-10.
Okay. So their index event is when a diagnosis of GI, one of those various GI complications occurs. Okay? So now we know that they've entered the cohort. When do they leave the cohort? What's that? So they say they have GI until the end of the database observation?
Well, I don't think O has an end, right? I mean, T and C should have an end. But
So it's an important conversation. So every cohort follows the same definition. It's a set of people who satisfy criteria for a duration of time. It turns out in many comparative cohort analyses, we only make use of the O's start date because oftentimes we are interested in, like, for example, the incidence of an outcome. You just care about the first start date. However, it is possible for a person to have multiple GI complications, in which case a person could have a GI complication and it could resolve. And sometime later they could have another one and it could resolve. They could have another one sometime later and it could resolve. So the notion that I would encourage all of you to think about is that an outcome is a cohort that needs to have a cohort entry and a cohort exit, even if you're not making use of the exit. And as we go through this study in particular, I think actually you're going to realize that in this case, it's actually going to matter. So what did they do specifically? How did they define when the events happened, when they started and when they ended. So here, start is at the time of a diagnosis. Oh, sorry, for the outcome.
So the
Yeah, no, sorry, yes.
know the exit, right?
What's that?
The time they exited the cohort.
So right now, if we all agree, the cohort entry was at the time of a diagnosis. So when did they leave the outcome cohort? That's for the exposure cohort, right?
Yes.
See, in some furrowed brows here. So one of the things is you will not find very many papers where an outcome is actually described as a cohort. And I will say, I don't think you're going to find in there, in that paper, a very clear, cogent description of a cohort exit, in part because a lot of the times when we write these papers, we describe the exposure cohorts, and then we just say, and then people had an event. And even when they're programming it in their favorite SAS language or whatever, they're just creating an indicator flag of yes, no, they had the event. But let's think about GI complication in the data. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that exit is on the same day as entry. So you just had an event means you had a code, right? That might be reasonable for some people to do that. So how many people here are working with claims data? Well, like the left side of the room is working with claims, okay? Well, so the right side of the room, pay attention to what the left side of the room is about to say. So if I were to look for GI complications in claims data, what are some potential problems that might happen? There might be a competing risk, okay? You might just not actually be observed because you have to have a health encounter. What about the GI events that actually are in the data? So the actual ICD-10 code. So right now our cohort definition is when they have a code. What? Go ahead. Okay, so you're going to see a code, but the code might be wrong or misclassified, sure. So that it could just be a rule-out code. How many codes do you think one person gets if they have a GI complication bad enough to require inpatient hospitalization? Maybe multiple? Okay, so
Depending on the data set that you were using, we have up to 50 IC9 codes. If it's a 200 version.
So a claims record in many systems, one claims record might have 15 diagnosis code fields. One inpatient hospitalization generates 10, 100 more records. So that provides 15 times 100 opportunities for this one little code to show up in one hospitalization. So if our cohort definition was just the existence of a code, does that mean that if I have an inpatient hospitalization for GI bleed with a code, but I have a code for every piece of care, are those all different GI events? They're the same event. So how do we think about creating a cohort definition that isn't just going to be based on the existence of a code? Tie it to a visit. So we could say the visit that had a GI code. Okay. So that's a good idea, Christophe. So we create a visit that has a GI code. That's a good idea. Now, if I have a GI complicated event and I go to the hospital, chances are my doc's going to tell me, why don't we come back in a week and make sure that you're okay. So I'm going to now have a second visit afterwards with probably that code's going to be written down because it's the follow-up care for that. So I'm now going to have two visits that satisfy this cohort definition of a visit with a GI code. Do you want to count those as two events? It's the same event. So we could think about using the condition era, which hopefully would collapse things together. We could use a first event, so that's an interesting idea. So we could say the first visit with a GI event. Okay? How do people feel about that? But we could have a recurring problem. So we've got an issue here, right? Because maybe you're interested in the first event for your particular question, but maybe you're interested in how many times someone had a GI complication. Okay, so we could have, okay, so to have some sort of a gap between visits. So maybe you say a visit with a GI event and no other visit with a GI event in some period prior. So that gives you someone, okay.
And also that the codes, the ICD codes don't have, no guarantees to determine whether they actually from.
That's right, so the codes are not very specific of what there are, okay. The reason why I wanted to talk through this example is I find it a challenge when I'm reading the literature and I'm looking at how we spend a pretty good amount of time in in the literature describing our cohort, or cohorts as the way that we would frame it. And we spend a good amount of time describing clinically what the outcome is. And some papers even actually bother to provide you the code set. So they say, my event is ICD-10s. However, the logic of implementing an outcome is very, very often tricky. And what we've actually found as valuable about this framework is by forcing you to think about it as a cohort and creating the logic of when does a person get the event and have entry into the cohort, and when do they stop having the event, therefore coming out, that actually helps to clarify the issue that otherwise will get very commonly scrambled up when you're reading a bunch of these studies. So I guess my interpretation, but want it to be an open discussion, my interpretation is I'm not exactly sure what they did with the outcome, because I really understand what codes they use, but I don't really understand what logic was applied to find these events.
Yes. So I don't think from reading this that you had to have a GI code to enter the study. It was just your first prescription of one of those two drugs. Yeah. And
correct. The exposure cohorts are just based off of the drugs, absolutely. I'm talking only about defining the O cohort, the outcome cohort. What are the events we're looking for?
So the hospitalization for the UG, the upper GI
Yep.
complication.
So how would you want to define that outcome?
They define it based on the different codes.
So
Presumably it's the first occurrence.
presumably it's the first occurrence.
Yeah.
What do people think? Do they think it's first occurrence? How many people think it's first occurrence? Okay. How many people think it's all occurrences? Okay. How many people think it's the first occurrence after exposure start? You think it's first occurrence after exposure start. Some people think it's first occurrence. Some people think it's all occurrences. Did we screw up when we sent the... It's one paper you're all reading, right? So, yes?
They're using a Poisson regression to estimate the rate ratios on that must involve multiple occurrences.
So Christophe's point is they are using a Poisson regression. A Poisson regression is estimating a rate and has a core assumption behind it that there is a rate of events, which should mean that there is, at least one would think, the opportunity to have more than one event. So that would seem to, that would violate the assumption of it being either the first occurrence ever or the first occurrence after exposure start. Or maybe they just applied the wrong model. I don't know. Yeah?
And to add that, even just reading the description, when I think about, complications, I think about a horizon window where they could have multiple complicating events.
Oh, so complications is plural, so that sounds like multiple events.
It doesn't say reduced upper GI incident.
Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the attempt to replicate this study. We're not going to put value judgments on what they did. We are just going to see how well you can replicate this study using the tools that we've got. As you run into issues where you don't know what they did, take note of those. Ask your colleagues as you're going through this. I can say that I think there's a bunch of things that are kind of unresolved, and when you get those, just mark them down for yourself as, hey, this was ambiguous, and then make a choice based on what you think that they might have done. Okay? Here's how I want you to do it. Here's my here's the high level descriptions, but we're going to get into the low level of actually designing this formally. So you're right. It's COX-2 versus NSAID new users. We've got these upper GI complications somehow. Oh, I didn't actually ask about time at risk. I'm stating this is cohort start to cohort end, but how would you guys define it? During the time that they were exposed? Was it some fixed window?
It was the time of initiation, and then exit is defined as discontinuation or switch of the initial drug, or disenrollment from the provider, hospitalization outcome, or diagnosis of cancer, death, or the end of the study period of administrative service.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that we think that this framework can actually be helpful for, let's actually, I'd like you to read that again, but let's hit each of the criteria and think about what that criteria is. So first one was?
So cohort exit was defined as discontinuation or switch of the initial NSAID.
Okay, so discontinuation or switch. So basically, you started on a drug, and so one way that you could leave the cohort is you stopped the drug, or you switched to something else, but you stopped the drug. Okay.
Disenrollment from the SHI provider.
Okay, so you leave the database, so you're out because you're at the end of the database time.
Hospitalization for the GI complication.
So this is an interesting one, right? So we're defining a cohort of exposed people, but somehow we're using the outcome to define the censoring of the exposed population. That seems to me to seem more like an analysis choice than a cohort definition choice. But we could think about that. What happens if you do censor a population at the first hospitalization?
Well, I mean, if you're doing time to event analysis, they're not, because they're doing the signs, so.
A little tricky, okay? But let's pin that one. Sounds like there's an inclusion criteria, but it's actually not really much of an inclusion criteria. It seems like it's something in the analysis design. What's the next one?
Hospital diagnosis of cancer, death, or the end of the study period, whichever came first.
So study period could make sense, right? You just got some calendar time and you wanted to apply that. The other one was experiences a cancer in the future. And so we also had a criteria that they couldn't have cancer in the past, but now you're thinking also if they develop cancer in the future, then somehow they're excluded. Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Is it because of other cancer drugs and hospital complications? Interfere with the cancer drug complications?
What do you guys think? So the reason why I want you to reflect on these things, not so much as the values, but think about the particulars of this, and think about, if we go back to the DeLorean picture, usually we want to define our population at the moment of a decision. We are going to use information in the past as the criteria to define that population so that we can look forward for a potential outcome. When we start defining cohorts and using information after the decision, you just have to be concerned about the consequences of what that would mean. In contrast, and as Martijn will go through with the analysis choices, in the analysis you can actually make specific specifications if there's need for dealing with competing risks or what have you. But it's important to distinguish what is a cohort definition characteristic from what is a model specification characteristic. Does everybody agree the model spec here is one-to-one propensity score matching? Then it's Poisson regression. So Poisson regression says that that means we're doing a rate ratio. And so somehow we're either doing a rate ratio on either one event per person or maybe multiple, depending on how the outcome was defined, which we're all a little bit confused by. Okay, but other than the outcome, seems like it's great. Okay, hands-on exercise. So what I want you to do is, we just spent some time talking about the cohorts, and what I'd like for you to do is, first, let's focus on all of the decisions that go into everything except for T, C, and O. We just talked conceptually about T, C, and O. What I want you to focus on is, let's design the rest of the study, assuming that you could define a T, C, and O. So I want you to go into Atlas, for those of you who've got your computer, or look over your shoulder if you don't have your computer out, and go to odyssey.org/web/atlas. And we'll see how robust the combination of the Wi-Fi plus the web API that Lee beefed up for us. See how well this goes. You should, once you get into Atlas, you should be able to see on the left-hand side a tab that says Estimation. So you should be able to just click on that. And then from there, in the top right-hand corner, you should see a button that says New Population Level Effect Estimation. So I want you to click on that, and that should open up a blank form where you are going to get to replicate this study. Okay. So now that you see the link, I'm going to just pull open and show you exactly what I'm asking for you to do in Atlas. I'm going to Atlas. I'm clicking on Estimation, and I'm clicking on New Population Level Effect Estimation. So they should all be here. Okay? So I'm going to encourage everybody just put whatever, Odyssey tutorial Garba, and then put your name. Okay. Now, you'll notice that in Atlas, you can't yet save this because you have not made a single choice. And the core choices that have to be made before you even can start a study is you got to define your T, C, and O, of course. So in this case, for purposes of this first exercise, I'm going to provide you the T, C, and O because you just told me that you understood it. At least T and C, we feel like we actually did a pretty good job as a group. O is what it is. So all you do to select your cohorts is you just click this little window here, and then you can search for a cohort. So if you just type in Garba, you'll see that there are cohorts already there for the target cohort. You can search for the comparator cohort, and you can search for the outcome cohort. Okay. We've now picked our T, C, and O's. Now we have a whole bunch of choices that we need to make, although I'm going to make one more, we're going to do one more together, which is choosing the statistical model. We all agreed that they did Poisson regression, right? So select Poisson regression, and at that point, you have now specified a full study. But there's a lot more choices that you guys need to make. But at this point, you can see that the Save button becomes activated. So go ahead and click Save. And now you are designing your own study. So what I want you to do is, we've now given you a T, C, and O, and you know the model type. What I would like for you guys to do now, working together or individually, is go through and let's go through all of the other decisions and see think about what decisions did Garba make. Okay, so maybe let's take 10 minutes here and just go through the questions individually and think about what choices the Garba team made in their paper. If you have a question about it, either because the paper is ambiguous or you have a question about what's being asked in Atlas, please raise your hand and one of us is going to come over and chat with you. So 10 minutes yourself. Design your own study. Replicate Garba's study.